because we know what we're doing. Everyone hears Psalm 23 still, and we're going to read Psalm 23 together as we begin these 6 verses. You ready? The Lord is my shepherd. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, great job. You can have a seat. This is God's Word. We've been in this several weeks. We'll wrap up this series next week on Father's Day. Do you remember the very first photo we looked at in this series was a sheep named Barak? Remember Barak? Here's a picture of him, remember? Remember he was found, he'd been in the wilderness in Australia. He was found, some people took him to an animal shelter there. And I've forgotten how many extra pounds of wool he had, something like, I think it was like 68 pounds of wool or something like that. And then they took care of him, and these are the after pictures for Barak. There he is after they sheared him, one with the vest on. Clearly they're taking good care of him, and he looks quite a bit different, right? Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Do you think that transition from that first picture, from picture A to picture B, was not without some difficulty? Do you think when they sheared Barak that it wasn't a difficult time for him when that was going on? Do you think there wasn't some fear involved and some questions involved and some all-out probably fear and trepidation involved? That's the reality. You don't get from the first picture to the second picture without some difficulty. And that's kind of what we're looking at this morning. Before we do, let me do a quick review of where we've been. I want to do it in a little different way this morning. Let me give you some phrases that tell you where we've been. Because we determined that once we understand that we are his sheep, that we belong to him, he owns us, then he becomes my shepherd and your shepherd. And so here's our summation. My shepherd is Yahweh. I don't lack anything. Because my shepherd is Yahweh, because if you're a believer today, your shepherd is Yahweh. He is the self-existent, eternal God who always was, always will be, does not change, all-powerful. There's nothing you lack, nothing that you need in life that you really lack. Secondly, we learn my shepherd gives spiritual nourishment and rest. He makes me lie down in green pastures, leads me beside quiet waters. And so he gives us nourishment, he gives us rest. And then my shepherd retrieves me and revives me. He restores my soul, remember? He comes and finds us, retrieves us, and then he revives us. Remember the picture of the cast sheep that couldn't get up, and the shepherd picks him up and sets him upright. And then my shepherd leads me on the right path. He leads me not just on the right path and in the right direction, but in the right way, on the right path. And then finally, my shepherd does this for his glory and my good. Ultimately, his name is at stake, and so our shepherd leads us for his glory, but whenever something is for his glory, it is for our good at the same time. And then that leads us to verse 4 this morning. Here's verse 4, and that's what we'll talk about today. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, it's important that we look at and understand those first 2 words. And I'm going to show them to you in several translations. And what I just read you was even though. If you learned it in the King James Version, you probably memorized it. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I think maybe the one that catches the teaching the best and what's really written is even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The reason these 2 words are important is these 2 words connect verse 3 with verse 4. Now remember verse 3? He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So he's leading us in these righteous paths for his name's sake. But that means he also, sometimes those paths include the valley of the shadow of death, or dark valleys, if you will. Why? Why would he do that? Because the same reason a shepherd would lead sheep through the valley, a dark valley, is to get them to a different pasture, to take them to a higher pasture, another pasture. So here's the point as I begin this, and we need to understand this in our Christian walk. Sometimes the dark valleys are just as much the leading of our shepherd as the green pastures and the quiet waters. God uses the dark valleys in our lives. So understand in your Christian life, there will be those moments of the dark valleys. There's a purpose in them. So second question is this, what does it mean? What is the valley of the shadow of death? What does that phrase mean? It's one of the best known images in all of literature. We hear it, and we hear it used primarily in funeral services. It's very often used inappropriately so. I'll talk about that later in the message. But a lot of people thought that when David wrote this, that David was describing a real place, this valley of the shadow of death. David would lead his sheep, and very often he would lead them in places where there would be predators after these sheep, and also there would be thieves out to steal his sheep. And there's a specific valley that some of the commentators think David was referring to when he said the valley of the shadow of death. It's a valley called the Wadi Kelt. It's near Bethlehem. And so probably, in all probability, when David tended his father's sheep, we know he was a shepherd, he probably led his sheep through this valley on a number of occasions. Now, I want you to look at a picture of this Wadi Kelt. Here's a picture of the Wadi Kelt. Now, I want you can see the deep valley down below, the cavern down below. You can see how narrow the path, and this is a more modern picture, obviously. But can you imagine leading sheep through that valley? Here's another picture of it, different direction. And can you imagine, when you see how dangerous that cliff would be going down? You can see there are caves along the way, all sorts of things. That's what David had in mind, some commentators think. Now, I want to read you what one shepherd, more of a modern-day kind of shepherd writer, said about the Wadi Kelt and about this valley of the shadow of death. He said, "It's a very narrow defile through a mountain range where the water often foams and roars, torn by jagged rocks. The path plunges downward into a deep and narrow gorge of sheer precipices, overhung by frowning sphinx-like battlements of rocks, which almost touch overhead. Its side wall rise like the stone walls of a great cathedral. The valley is about 5 miles long, yet it's not more than 12 feet at the widest section of the base. The actual path on the solid rock is so narrow that in places the sheep can hardly turn around in case of danger. In places, gullies 7 and 8 feet have been washed." So you get a picture from the picture and from that writing. Now I want to read you what one more writer says, because he makes a point in here that I really think is important. Listen to what this writer says. He says, "Valleys of the shadow of death are paths which wind in between mountains where there are dark shadows and deep gorges. Travelers march slowly and silently in order to avoid being seen or heard by bandits. The fear of death is constantly in their minds. They tremble, they expect trouble or death at any time while they're passing through. The valley of death, or deep darkness," and by the way, the translation of the valley of the shadow of death can also be translated, the valley of deep darkness, is a section of trail that cannot be avoided. Listen, it's a section of trail that cannot be avoided. There's no bypass road and no magical escape. The only way forward is through the valley. And that's true in real life as well. There's no way avoiding some trails, some valleys in life. It's just a reality that we're all going to face. Now remember, this whole chapter is metaphorical. We're not real sheep. Jesus isn't a real shepherd in the sense of a sheep and shepherd, although he is our shepherd in this metaphorical sense in a beautiful, beautiful symbolic way. But what's the psalmist saying to us here? He's saying there are going to be times in your life and my life where we're going to face these dark valleys and these narrow trails on these dark valleys, and there's no way around them. The only way to proceed is through these dark valleys. That's the reality. What's the purpose? There is a purpose. Just like for the shepherd and the sheep, he's taking his sheep to other pasture. God has a purpose in my life and your life when he takes us through these times. There's a reason that God is doing this. And so metaphorically, what are we talking about? We're talking about real life stuff that's difficult. We're talking about going through some illness, some sickness, maybe disability. We're talking about legal issues that may not go away. We're talking about financial issues that may be difficult and ongoing and tough stuff. We're talking about maybe having children in trouble. You know, there's nothing more agonizing than that. Maybe a friend or a family member we love that's in crisis. All these different kind of things. Addictions, loneliness, depression, terminal illness, aging, old age, death, injustice. All of these things become in a sense, deep, dark, or can become deep, dark valleys for us. And sometimes there's just no way around them. We can only go through them. I think one of the most beautiful biblical illustrations of this is one of my two favorite biblical characters. I always argue about which one's my favorite biblical. This is setting Jesus' favorite, okay? Beyond that, my two favorite biblical characters are Daniel and Joseph. But you think about Joseph's life and the dark valley Joseph went through. Remember what happened in his life? I mean, he's a teenager when his brothers, throw him in a pit and then sell him into slavery. So here he is, through no fault of his own, where he's in this pit and sold into slavery. And it's interesting, I'd forgotten this part because I have Joseph on such a high pedestal that he handled the dark valley of his life, which lasted about 13 years, by the way. He handled this dark valley so great, I forget that he was human. But when his brothers first did this to him, he's crying in anguish. There's fear in his life. And he's crying out and pleading with his brothers. And so there's that side of it, but he handled it in such a great way. And he was sold into slavery. He was put in prison for something he did not do. He faced all these different things, but yet once he was through the valley, God took Joseph and he raised him up until he went up all the way to number 2 in Egypt. There was no one in Egypt above Joseph other than Pharaoh himself. That's what God did in his life as he went through, after he went through, and a result of going through this dark valley. And that doesn't mean we're always going to be going through a dark valley and rise up to number 2 in the land like Joseph did. But the reality is we go through these dark valleys because God has another pasture, another place to take us. That's the reality. There was a famous football coach. You may not remember him. Some of you will. His name was Lou Holtz. And he had a really good way with words. And he was talking about how God doesn't give us more than we can handle. You've heard that said. Here, listen to this quote from Lou Holtz. He said, God may not give us more than we can bear, but sometimes I think he overestimates my ability. Now, I like that. I mean, isn't that the way it feels? When we're in a dark valley, when we're in the valley of the shadow of death, we don't think we can handle it. It's too tough, but the reality is we can. Now, we saw those first 2 pictures of Barak, and I talked about that sheep, and I talked about how there had to be a transition period that couldn't have been comfortable. Look at this third picture of him. This is when they're shearing Barak. Now, if you look closely, the lady's holding his head at the front. At first, I thought she was just being kind. No, she's holding his head, and at the back, the guy's got a hold of his fleece, holding him down, and then the shearer's going on. This animal's probably been out in the wild for a year or so. How do you think Barak's feeling in this moment? Do you think he's a little scared? Do you think he's a little afraid? Do you think it's comfortable what he's going through? Now here's the question. Do you think there's any way he understands that what they're doing for him in this moment is in his best interest? Is there any chance that he knows that what they're doing is in his best interest? And furthermore, do you think there's any way they could communicate with him and say, Barak, listen, this is in your best. Just listen to me. You'll understand when you hear do you think? There's no way. The same thing, this happened to me this week. I'm not making this story up. This happened on Friday. And during the sermon, I thought about it during the sermon, and I got myself in trouble talking about it, but I'm going to do it again anyway. On Friday, we had this kid in my neighborhood. His name's John, and for the last 2 years, John's done my yard for me. He was a high school student and a great kid. And he did a great job, and it was really cool. He would weed eat our yard and cut it, and we have kind of a big yard. And he even, when he would edge it, he would literally edge it riding a hoverboard. He'd ride a hoverboard and edge our yard. Isn't that crazy? Anyway, great kid, very smart. Well, he deserted me, went off to A&M, became an Aggie. And so he just finished, other than that, he's a great kid. So he finished his first year at A&M, but he's like a kid to us. He is a godly kid. I love this kid. He leaves next week to go off to be a counselor at a camp all summer long. He's in my house. We're talking. He came by to see us. We're just catching up, and we're in the den talking. And we look out the back window, and there's a big turtle in my backyard. He's a big turtle. It's like, I'm trying not to exaggerate, but it's something like this. And it's a hard shell turtle, so it's got a pretty tall shell. And we're watching this turtle. I said, look at that, John. I'd seen the turtle earlier in the day in our front yard, and he'd go all the way around the yard. And some way he got into our backyard. I don't know how, unless somebody left the gate open. We have this ornamental iron fence, and there's a low rail on it. And he kept trying to get out of the yard, and he couldn't get out of the yard. And the turtle was smart enough. It's going up and down the fence line, and it's a pretty long line, and it's hot, and I'm seeing this turtle, and I start feeling sorry for this turtle. I said, John, we got to go get this turtle out because there's a lake like 100 yards beyond our house down to the side, and I know that's where he's trying to go. And I said, John, we got to go help this turtle. Well, we go out back, and this Aggie and I, we're both too afraid to pick him up. And so we're trying to lead the turtle to the back gate. Have you ever tried to lead a turtle? They don't follow very well. And furthermore, when you get behind them and try to direct them, they don't particularly care for that either. And so John and I are out trying to get this turtle out this back gate. Now, Josie yells off the porch, how many Aggies does it take to get? No, I'm not an Aggie, but anyway, a whole nother issue. So finally, we get this turtle out the gate, and we're just like, oh, so cool, he's out and he's going. So it was really cool. But here's the deal. Do you think that turtle had any idea that we really had his best interest at heart? We were trying to help him get to where he wanted to go. We really wanted him to. And we're talking, like idiots, we're talking to the turtle like he's going to understand us. Would he ever understand us when we tried to explain, this is in your best interest, so let us push you this? No. Why? Because we're up here and the turtle's down here, and the turtle can't understand our communicating with him. Listen, when you and I go through the valley of the shadow of death or the deep, dark valley, the chasm between me and a turtle, I'm barely over the turtle, but the chasm between us and God is much, much, much greater, infinitely greater. And we may not understand why we go through the valley of the shadow of death. And you say, well, why doesn't God make us understand? Because we're not capable of understanding God's ways in some of these matters. Because he's so far above us. But here's what we can know when this happens. We can know we don't have to fear. And that's what this verse is all about. We don't have to fear when we go through the valley of the shadow of death. Why not? 2 reasons. The first reason we don't have to fear is because of the shepherd's presence. Listen, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. It's really interesting and encouraging too when you see a Christian walk through the valley of the shadow of death and you see them do it without fear in their life. Probably the first Christian martyr in the Bible is in Acts 7 was Stephen. Remember the story of Stephen? And he preached this magnificent sermon, and the religious guys wanted to kill him. But here's what Scripture says in verse 55. But being full of the Spirit, he gazed intently into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And then they really got mad, and then they began to stone him. And that means they began to throw rocks at him to kill him. And here's what Stephen said. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Not a sign of fear in Stephen. Why? He knew of God's presence. He knew God's presence was with him. And this verse is not just for when we're facing physical death. It's for that, but not just for that time. It's in any dark valley that we face. Listen to how Robert Morgan, he has a wonderful book on the 23rd Psalm. Listen to how he paraphrases the verse. He says, even in the darker moments of life or in death, I will not give way to panic or anxiety. With the Lord with me, there's no room for fear. Even when, especially when, it's beyond our capacity to understand what God is leading us through. Remember, he leads us through these dark valleys sometime. Even when we don't understand, we don't have to fear. Why? Because we can know that he's with us. Did you notice this is even in the language of the psalm here too? Not just in the overall picture of it, but you see it in the language. Up to this point, David's been saying he, talking about the Lord. The Lord is my shepherd. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He. And now he comes to this verse and he says, even though I walk through the valley of shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. It's no longer he. Now it's a prayer, and he says, God. He's been talking about his shepherd. And now you see the intimacy of him beginning to talk with his shepherd and to his shepherd. That's a beautiful, beautiful picture. And at this point, the psalm becomes much more intimate. It becomes much more personal. Much like, listen to Isaiah 40:11. You get a picture of this intimacy with the shepherd in Isaiah 40:11. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. And then Jesus said it in John 10. Listen to the intimacy of Jesus talking about him being our shepherd in John 10:14. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep and they know me. Do you hear the intimacy in that of a personal relationship where we know the shepherd and the shepherd knows us? We don't have to fear, even in those dark valleys of life, because of his presence. The second reason we don't have to fear in the dark valleys of life is because of the shepherd's power. The verse ends, it says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, to understand that statement, we have to understand the purpose of a shepherd with the rod and the staff. The rod was used for a number of things. It was not a walking stick. The rod was something they say about 2.5 feet long, and the end would have been heavy. It would have had some iron or something like that on the end of it, and it was a weapon. In fact, the word is shabet. It means rod or scepter or weapon. And it's something he would use for a number of different things. The shepherd would have used for a number of different things. One of them is he'd use it to count his sheep. At night out in the pasture, if he brought the sheep back to the sheepfold, he would hold the rod out and make the sheep pass under the rod. By the way, it's another picture of intimacy here because they had passed under the rod and it was a chance for the shepherd to examine the sheep and make sure they were okay. But as they passed under the rod, he would count the sheep. And if one of the sheep was missing, he would know. When he finished his count, he would know if there was one missing. And we saw in one of the earlier sermons, remember what he does if there's a sheep missing? He goes looking for the sheep and he retrieves the sheep and revives the sheep. So in a very real sense, the rod becomes like an alarm system. And think about it for you and me. It means this is an alarm that God has. He watches us, he knows us, and he knows when there's something wrong. He knows when we're missing, and he comes searching for us, and he retrieves us and revives us and calls him back to himself. But the rod was also an offensive weapon. When the sheep are going through those dark valleys, and picture that ravine again, that they would go through those dark valleys, and if there were thieves there or if there were predators there, the rod would become the instrument of defense for the sheep. And it was a very, very good offensive weapon, I should say. You think back to David's life. If you think David couldn't wield the rod as a shepherd, think about what he said to Saul. Remember what the most famous story of David's life is probably what? David and Goliath, right? Remember he went out to his brothers, dad sent him out, he goes out, checks it out, and then he sees this Philistine giant yelling and screaming at him, and why don't one of you guys go and fight this dude? David said, I'll go. He's just a young guy. And Saul said, and when the king heard this, he said, what makes you think you can fight this giant? Here's what David said to him. Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. What's David saying? David said, I have a rod. And I would grab him and he would hit him with this rod, this offensive weapon, even to the defense of a lion, a mountain lion that's after his sheep. He would go after them. And the picture is for you and I, as we're safe from predators and from thieves and those that would come after us, because our shepherd has this offensive weapon to defend us. And the staff was a whole different tool. It wasn't used to defend the flock. It was used more to nurture the flock. If you remember the video we saw of the sheep that got stuck in the crevice a few weeks ago, that shepherd's staff had a crook on the end of it. It would be used to retrieve sheep, maybe grab them by the foot and help them out of situations like that. Or if they're along those narrow paths, to keep them from going over, he would press against the side and keep the sheep away from the edge where it would fall and hurt. It was used more to guide the sheep to those green pastures and the still waters to make sure their needs were met. So the rod is used to protect them from external threats, but the staff was used to assist the flock and the nurturing of the flock. That's the picture. You see the picture of the psalm overall now, this verse overall now? The valley of the shadow of death and how our shepherd leads us through the dark valleys of life. Let me deal with a couple of things, and we'll wrap up with these two things. Because this doesn't just refer to dark valleys. It does refer to death as well. And that's why I say it's very appropriate to use it at funeral services, and we do very often. But what's the point? What are we saying in this? Because none of these journeys, none of these walks in the valley of the shadow of death, none of them, they're not dead ends, if you will. And I don't mean that as a pun. There's not a dead end. We go through them. We have to go through them. But what does it mean? How do we face the valley of the shadow of death when it comes to the end? Because eventually that's our last valley we go through, all of us. Not a single one of us will avoid that valley of the shadow of death. And Donald Ray Barnhouse gives us great help here. Barnhouse had children and his wife died. He was a great preacher, by the way. He was a Presbyterian preacher and a terrific preacher, very well known. And his wife died, and he was trying to find a way to explain to his children what had happened to their mom and where she was. And after the funeral, one day after the funeral, he was driving the car, and a big moving van went past their car. And when it did, the shadow of the van passed over their car. And Barnhouse thought, and he asked his kids, he said, would you rather get hit by the shadow of that van, or would you rather get hit by the van? And his little girl said, well, Dad, that's a silly question. Obviously, we'd rather get hit by the shadow of the van because the shadow can't hurt you. And he said, that's right. And he said, that's exactly what happened to your mom. Because 2,000 years ago, Jesus took the van ran over Jesus. He went to the cross. He died in our place. He shed his blood. He was crucified, buried, and God raised him from the dead, and he defeated death. And so now when we go through the valley of the shadow of death, all death does is hit us with the shadow of death. Jesus has already defeated death. And your mom is fine. She's in heaven today, as alive as she's ever been. She was just hit by the shadow of death. That's why I say it's even the valley of the shadow of death is not a dead end. It's just for those that know Christ, it's the way through. Now, one final thought. I was looking for a way to wrap this up the other day, and I had a specific thing I wanted to use. And so I was going to ask some of our staff couples until I found one that had the right answer for me, and I didn't have to look for it because the first people I talked to had the right answer. Do you remember, I don't remember, was it last Saturday night or the Saturday before we had the real bad storm in the middle of the night, about 2:30 in the morning? Remember the thunder and lightning was incredible. It was crazy loud. And so the first person I asked about it was Lauren Ferrum. And I said, Lauren, during that storm, they have 3 children. I said, did any of your kids come to your room during that storm? And she laughed. She said, all 3 of them did. She said, when that first thunder hit, it was so loud that within seconds, their middle child was at their door saying, I can't sleep. And they made a place for her to lay down, and she laid down. And she said, just a minute later, here came the second child. It's really loud, and then another place for them to lay down, and they laid down. And then the third one showed up, and a place for the third one, and I said, well, okay, they all went to sleep right away. She said, yeah, and I said, here's my question, because the storm, if you remember, the storm lasted a little while. There was more thunder that came. And I said, did they ever wake up again? She said, no, they never woke up again. Why? Because it was the presence of their dad and their mom, and so they felt safe. Do you see the picture here? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. We don't have to fear. He is with us, and he has us.